It was the kind of silence that felt like a weight, a thick, almost suffocating quiet that hung between the trees. In the dense forest, the only sounds were the soft whir of wind passing through the leaves and the distant, broken breath of an officer, half buried under the wreckage of a collapsed building. His face was pressed into the dirt, his body wedged between jagged rocks, his limbs heavy, numb. But he wasn't alone. There, just feet away, a pair of eyes glistened from the darkness, eyes that had seen enough of human suffering to last a lifetime. A canine officer named Max, a dog built for the hard work of saving lives, stood still, his dark fur blending into the shadows. He knew the officer's scent, the scent of the one he called partner. The bond between them had been forged in years of loyalty, training, and shared dangers. But today, Max felt a pang of fear he hadn't known before. The officer's hand twitched. He was still alive. Max felt the familiar pang of instinct surge within him. Something deeper than training, something raw and wild. This wasn't just a rescue mission. This was something more. As Max took the first cautious step forward, the weight of the world seemed to shift. Max darted forward, sensing the urgency, the quiet desperation in the air. His paws struck the ground with precision, his movements practiced but desperate. The air was cold, thick with dust. The tremble in his muscles wasn't fear, it was determination. But the real battle was still ahead. The rescue operation had been long, the air thick with dust and confusion. But nothing could prepare Max for what he saw when they found Officer Blake. The building had collapsed without warning, a wave of debris crushing everything in its path. Max had been on the ground when it all happened. The crack of crumbling walls, the roar of splintering wood. It had all been too much, too fast. Officer Blake had been trapped, his leg pinned under heavy rubble, his breathing shallow, a groan escaping his lips with each movement. Max had found him first, alone, his fur matted with dirt, his nose pressed into the earth. There was no time to waste, no moment to wait for human assistance to catch up. Blake was alive, but for how long? Max's heart raced in his chest, feeling the intense pressure to do something. Anything to save the man who had always been his protector. His sharp nose caught the scent of Blake's blood, mixed with the sharp tang of dust and crushed concrete. He growled low, unsure of what to do. His training kicked in. Dig, find, rescue, but with every paw that dug deeper, the earth seemed to push back harder, suffocating Blake just a little more. He whimpered softly. He could feel the weight of the earth around them, closing in on his partner. He knew, deep down, that time was running out. Max, panting, pawed at the ground, as if begging for the earth to yield. But his eyes, filled with a kind of knowing, spoke a language only Blake could understand. "I'm here," they said. "I won't leave you." Hours passed before the human rescuers arrived, their voices calling out in the distance, but Max was already far beyond human help. His paws had dug into the earth, pulling at the debris, at the wreckage of a life. It wasn't until the human hands finally touched Blake's body, lifting the last pieces of rubble off of him, that Max could breathe again. Blake wasn't fully out yet, but he was alive. It wasn't until Max heard the faintest sound, soft, desperate, something close to a whisper, that he felt the real shift in the air. Blake's hand moved, almost imperceptibly, and he groaned, barely able to speak. Max licked Blake's face, his tongue rough against the sweat and blood, a silent plea in his actions. The rescue crew stared, unsure of what to do as they tried to assess Blake's injuries. But it wasn't their job anymore. Max had already taken it. He was the one who had never left Blake's side, the one who had stayed calm and steady when everything around them had crumbled. Blake, half conscious, reached out weakly for Max, pulling him close. His grip was weak, but the bond between man and dog was undeniable. They had saved each other before, in countless ways. But this time, Blake was a broken man, both physically and emotionally. His breath came in shallow bursts as Max sat beside him, looking up at the humans who were still frantic with preparations. Max's presence was a quiet reminder to Blake that he wasn't alone, not anymore. Max's eyes never left Blake as they worked to extract him from the rubble. The air was thick with dust, and the sky was turning a deep, brooding gray. But Max's focus was unwavering. The hands of the medics weren't his hands. They weren't the ones that had been there when Blake had needed him most. But they were trying, and that was enough for Max. For now, the days following the rescue blurred together. Blake had been rushed to the hospital, his wounds severe but survivable. Yet as the days went by, the true damage was harder to bear. He couldn't remember how many surgeries he'd endured, how many IVs had been injected into his arms, how many quiet nights had stretched on forever. His body was a battleground, but even more so, his spirit had been shattered. Max was there, of course, never straying far. The therapy sessions were long, sometimes agonizing. Blake's arm ached, his leg felt foreign, and his mind wasn't sure how to reconcile with the broken version of himself he saw in the mirror. The officer, who had once been confident and capable, was now fragile in ways he had never anticipated. And through it all, Max stayed. He was there in the room, lying next to Blake's hospital bed, offering nothing but his warm, comforting presence. Blake had always been the one to push through the hardest times. But this time, Max was the one who kept him going. There were moments when Blake would break down, when tears would roll down his cheeks in the middle of the night. But Max would nudge him with his cold nose, lay his head across Blake's lap and simply be. The dog didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. It was then, in the quiet comfort of his dog's loyalty, that Blake began to understand what it meant to truly heal. The way Max would nudge his hand, reminding him that he wasn't alone, reminded Blake that even in the darkest hours, he had something to fight for. His strength wasn't gone, it was waiting to be rediscovered. Months passed, and Blake, now healing both physically and mentally, returned to duty. His leg was stronger, his arm more capable. But something about the officer had changed. He wasn't the same man who had rushed into danger without a second thought. He was more aware of his limitations, more present in the little moments, more attuned to the life around him. Max had taught him that, and yet when the next emergency call came, it was the instinct to rush in, to protect, that overtook him. Max, as always, was by his side, ready to face whatever challenge came next. They were a team again, just as they had always been. But now, Blake didn't just rely on his strength. He relied on the quiet strength of his dog. Max's steady pace, his unwavering focus, was what kept him grounded when the world seemed to spin out of control. They faced danger together, once again. But this time, Blake knew something deeper. He wasn't invincible, and neither was Max. But together, they were something stronger than anything the world could throw at them. In the stillness of the forest, under the warmth of the morning sun, Blake sat with Max by his side. It was a rare moment of peace, a reminder that, even after the chaos and destruction, there was always a place to come home to. Blake reached over, gently scratching Max's ear, the familiar touch grounding him. "Thank you," Blake whispered, though he knew Max would never truly understand the weight of the words. But Max had always understood everything else. The silent moments, the quiet strength, the way they both held each other up when the world seemed too heavy. The two of them, man and dog, sat together, looking at the horizon. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do, more battles to fight, but for now, the world could wait. And as Blake breathed in the cool morning air, he felt something stir within him. A quiet joy, a new kind of peace. The weight of the world might never fully disappear, but it wasn't so heavy when he had Max by his side. And that, Blake realized, was enough. The months following their last call had been quieter than Blake ever imagined. He had returned to his duties, but with a different kind of perspective. The weight of the uniform didn't press down on him in the same way. He didn't feel invincible anymore. He felt human, vulnerable, like the fragility of life was something he could no longer ignore. It was in the small moments, the way Max would nudge his hand for attention, or how the light would slant through his office window just before dusk, that he felt the true measure of life's preciousness. But the world didn't stop moving. Calls still came. Emergencies still occurred. Blake and Max were called out again, as they always had been. The usual urgency flooded Blake's body, his pulse quickening. There was no time to think, no time to wonder if he was truly ready for what might come next. He was a first responder. That was all he knew. They drove through the heart of the city, Blake's fingers wrapped tightly around the steering wheel. The scent of leather seats, the hum of the engine beneath him. and the faint tremble in Max's breathing beside him. It all felt normal. But everything about this moment was anything but. The radio crackled to life, its message urgent. An accident, one involving a child. Blake's heart raced. The world seemed to slow around him, but the urgency, the pull to be there, was stronger than ever. He didn't think. He just moved, his hands working on autopilot, his focus entirely on the road ahead. Max sat alert, his eyes darting between Blake and the scene unfolding on the screen before them. When they arrived, the sight before them was a blur of chaos. People were everywhere, shouting, directing, trying to help, but it was too late. The child was trapped under the wreckage of a car, barely breathing, her tiny body twisted in a way that no one should ever have to see. Blake's gut twisted painfully. He looked at Max, and without a word, he was out of the car. Max followed close behind, his paws making barely a sound on the asphalt. Blake's mind moved quickly, too quickly for his body to keep up. The child, the car, Max. They would get through this, they had to. It was then that Max's instincts kicked in. The dog didn't hesitate. His nose pressed against the wreckage, sniffing, his body tensing as he moved carefully between the collapsed frame and the girl. He barked twice, his voice sharp, cutting through the noise. Blake followed, crouching low, his hands working quickly, methodically. The world faded into the background. It was just them, the girl, Max, and the bond of trust between Blake and his dog. Max's eyes never wavered. The dog's focus was unwavering, his presence commanding yet steady. Blake, heart racing, worked alongside him, feeling the pressure of time pushing against them. Every second counted. His hands were covered in dirt, but the only thing he could focus on was the soft, desperate sound of the girl's breath, so weak but still there. Max nudged the wreckage aside, his muscles working with the precision of years of training, as if he knew exactly what to do. And Blake followed, each movement a silent testament to their bond, his actions in sync with Max's. Together, they moved the final piece of the car's frame. The girl's tiny, fragile body was exposed, and for a moment Blake could barely breathe. Her chest rose and fell, but barely. She was still alive. In the days following the rescue, Blake couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It wasn't the first time he'd been part of a life or death situation, but it felt different this time. The girl, she was so small, so fragile, her tiny hand in his. When the medics had arrived, it had been a race against time to keep her alive. They had stabilized her, but there was a quiet tension in the air. It was the kind of silence that whispered of things unsaid. Max, too, had been restless. Blake could see it in the way the dog's eyes searched his, the unspoken question hanging between them. Did we do enough? Max's eyes seemed to ask. Can we save them all? Blake didn't have an answer. It was something he had come to understand in his years of service, that the true weight of a rescue didn't lie in the success, but in the act itself. The world didn't always give second chances. But Max was the one who never hesitated. And in that silent exchange, Blake knew he had learned something invaluable. But the girl, she wasn't just anyone. She was a little girl whose life had hung by a thread, whose survival had been a matter of seconds. In the hospital, Blake found himself standing beside her room, unsure of what to do. He had saved her, yes. But there was a deep, unsettling feeling gnawing at his chest. A few days later, he found himself walking toward her room, Max by his side as always. The nurses smiled when they saw them, their faces lighting up at the sight of the dog. It was the first time Blake had seen the girl awake, her eyes wide, her face pale but relieved. Her mother sat at her side, her hands gently brushing her daughter's hair. Blake felt a lump form in his throat as the mother turned to him. She stood, her eyes brimming with gratitude. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they both knew. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You saved my baby." Max moved closer, his body language soft, as if understanding the deep emotions in the room. The girl's hand reached out toward him, her fingers trembling as they touched his fur. And for a brief, perfect moment, everything else faded. The guilt, the pressure, the memories, all of it was gone, replaced by a single, powerful moment of peace. Blake didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Max had already said it all in the way he lowered his head, in the way his body leaned toward the girl's small touch. The days turned into weeks, and soon Blake found himself back on patrol with Max at his side. The weight of their bond had deepened in ways he hadn't expected. They didn't need words anymore. They were an unspoken language, a quiet understanding that transcended the noise of the world. But sometimes the silence was too much to bear. Blake's thoughts often turned inward, to the many lives he had touched, and to those he had lost. The girl's survival had been a miracle, but it wasn't enough. Not for him. Max's presence was the only anchor that kept him grounded, his constant reminder that there was always something worth fighting for, something worth protecting. It was during these long shifts, while the world around them was quiet, that Blake began to understand the true nature of his work. They weren't just saving lives, they were connecting them. And that was the most powerful thing Blake had ever known. Months passed, and Blake was no longer haunted by the lingering fear that once plagued him. He had learned to forgive himself, to move past the guilt of every life lost. He was no longer the officer who rushed into danger without thought. He was the man who knew the value of every moment, of every breath taken. Max was still by his side, a silent partner, but now something else had changed. Max had become more than just a partner. He had become Blake's constant, the one thing he could rely on when the world seemed too much to handle. As they stood together, overlooking the city, the sun dipping low on the horizon, Blake realized there was one thing left to do. They had a long road ahead of them, one filled with danger and unknowns, but they would face it together. Whatever the future held, Blake and Max would walk it side by side. And as Blake looked down at Max, the dog's eyes met his with a silent understanding. They were ready for whatever came next. Days turned to weeks, and though life had settled back into a rhythm, Blake found himself awake in the stillness of the night, wrestling with memories that would not fade. The sounds of the hospital, the crumpled car, the child's fragile hand in his, those images would forever play like a looping film in his mind. But now, it wasn't the rescues that lingered most, it was the quiet moments after. When the adrenaline faded and the real work of healing began, Max was there always. Blake could hear his steady breathing beside him, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, the soft thud of his tail occasionally tapping the floor, as if checking that Blake was still there. It was this quiet presence that pulled Blake through the nights, when the weight of his past rescues felt too heavy. Each day that passed, Blake became more aware of his own fragility, the fragility of all of them. They were only human, or in Max's case only dog. They couldn't save everyone. They couldn't always be there in time. Yet somehow, that was what made Max's loyalty even more precious. Every day he chose Blake. And in return, Blake was beginning to understand the deeper meaning of this bond, the power it had not only to heal but to transform. Max, with his unwavering commitment, was teaching Blake to face his own scars, to accept them, and to move forward. The road would be long, filled with calls to action, moments of terror, and the inevitable toll of time. But it was the unspoken moments, the ones where neither Blake nor Max needed to say anything, that made everything worthwhile. Max was no longer just a canine partner. He was Blake's anchor to the world, a world that, in many ways, had turned upside down after that fateful day in the Rubble. Together, they weren't just responding to emergencies. They were battling the aftermath of those moments, helping each other heal step by step. Blake's mind drifted back to the hospital, to that moment when the girl had reached out for Max. It had been more than just a rescue. It had been a reminder of the lives they touched in ways they might never fully understand. Max's simple gesture, the nudge of his head, the touch of his fur against the girl's hand, had done more than stabilize her physically. It had given her a piece of peace. And in that moment, Blake realized that perhaps that was what they did every time they suited up. They didn't just save lives. They reminded people that the world wasn't as cold as it seemed. That in the hardest of times, there was always someone there, always something to hold on to. It might be a hand or a dog's fur, or even a single moment of calm. Blake stood in the small park across from his home, Max sitting by his side, eyes watching the distant horizon. The city was quiet tonight, the kind of quiet that felt deep, filled with untold stories. The sky, tinged with purple and gold as the sun dipped low, seemed to hold the weight of the past and the promise of the future. "I don't know what's next, boy," Blake whispered, his voice steady but filled with a certain vulnerability. Max's ears flicked and his head turned, offering a gaze that said everything without saying a word. His warm presence beside Blake was all the answer he needed. "Yeah, I guess we're just gonna keep moving forward," Blake said, the uncertainty in his heart softened by the comfort of his dog's presence. Max's tail thumped once against the grass, a final note in the quiet symphony of their lives. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they could face it together. As Blake moved deeper into his recovery, both physically and emotionally, he began to realize that healing didn't come easy, and sometimes it didn't come at all. The scars on his body were only the beginning. They were visible, tangible reminders of the work he had chosen, but the sacrifices he had made. But the scars that ran deeper, the ones that sat beneath the surface, were harder to face. The guilt, the fear, the memories of lives that had been lost despite his best efforts. Those things didn't heal in a few weeks, no matter how many shifts he worked, no matter how many rescues he completed. Max, though, seemed to understand in a way no one else could. He was there in the quiet moments when Blake couldn't find the words, when the memories pressed in too tightly. It was Max's steady gaze, his calm presence, that reminded Blake that healing wasn't something that happened in a rush. It was slow, painstaking, and came in waves. Sometimes it felt like taking 2 steps forward only to fall 3 steps back. But Max, as always, was there to catch him, to pull him back up again. Blake thought about the girl again, her tiny hand in his as they pulled her from the wreckage. She had been a reminder of everything he had to give, but also everything he had to lose. The cost of their work, the cost of saving lives, wasn't always clear at the moment of impact. Sometimes it only became apparent later, in the stillness of the night, in the weight of the silence. But Max, for all his strength and silent wisdom, had taught Blake one thing above all: it wasn't the saving that mattered most. It was the constant effort to try, to show up, to be there, even when it felt like the world was falling apart. Blake didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to save everyone. He just needed to keep showing up, and with Max by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next, knowing that their bond would always be a light in the darkness. As the seasons changed, so did Blake's understanding of what it meant to live with purpose. The calls for help didn't slow down, but the fear of failure that once paralyzed him no longer had the same grip on his heart. He had learned that it wasn't about the victories or the losses, it was about the journey. And as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden light across the landscape, Blake knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone. He never had been. The road ahead would be filled with more moments of challenge, more difficult decisions, and more lives to save. But there was no longer fear in the uncertainty. There was only gratitude. Gratitude for the bond he shared with Max, and for the understanding that, together, they could face anything. "Ready for the next one, Max?" Blake asked, his voice steady but filled with hope. Max's ears perked up, his body leaning forward ever so slightly, eyes focused and ready. He was more than just a partner. He was Blake's heart in a world that sometimes didn't make sense. Blake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past, but also the lightness of the present. With Max by his side, there was nothing they couldn't face, and as the world stretched before them, filled with both known and unknown dangers, Blake knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead was long, but together, they would walk it. And that was enough. The days felt like they were slipping through Blake's fingers, yet the weight of his journey was never truly gone. He had once believed that the hardest part of a rescue was the moment of impact. The moment when you pulled someone from the wreckage, and you knew, with a rush of adrenaline, that you had saved a life. But now, standing in the shadows of what felt like countless lives saved, he realized the real challenge had only begun. Max had been by his side for every moment, each rescue, each heartbreak. But it wasn't just the rescues that had bound them together. It was the quiet moments between them. The late night walks when Blake couldn't sleep, The hours spent by the window, watching the world outside, silent but understanding. They were a team forged in pain. And though Max's eyes never wavered, Blake could see the shift in them. Max knew just as he did that their bond wasn't invincible. They would face more trials ahead. Some they couldn't control, but it was the quiet trust between them that made it all bearable. Max's fur was beginning to show signs of age, his once dark coat turning to a graying hue around his muzzle. The soft click of his paws against the concrete was no longer as quick as it used to be, but in each step, Blake saw the embodiment of loyalty, strength, and unwavering love. Their lives together had been one long journey, and Blake had come to accept that, while the road ahead would still be unpredictable, it was one he would walk with his heart open to whatever came next. But just as the calm began to settle over them, as the rhythm of their partnership became familiar once more, the universe, in its infinite complexity, threw another curveball. Blake received a call on his off-duty day. The emergency dispatcher's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. An accident, a family trapped in an overturned car. The location was miles away, deep in the woods, far from the nearest hospital. Time was critical. They needed Blake. They needed Max. The moment the phone call ended, Blake was already in motion. Max perked up at the sound of the door opening, sensing the shift in the air. It was a momentary flash, a second when the future seemed uncertain, but Blake didn't hesitate. "Ready, boy?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with urgency. Max's tail thumped against the floor twice. And just like that, without another word, they were on their way, the night falling around them like a blanket. The drive was long, the silence between them punctuated only by the low hum of the engine and Max's occasional shift in the seat. They had been through countless rescues, but each one still carried its own weight. Blake's heart thudded in his chest. He knew they had a long way to go. Knew the hourglass was already running out. But it was the raw, sharp edge of the unknown that always made his breath hitch. What if this time they didn't make it in time? But it wasn't Max's job to ask what ifs. It was his job to get the job done, and Blake trusted him with every fiber of his being. By the time they reached the accident site, the forest had grown eerily quiet. A deep, unsettling silence hung in the air, broken only by the crunch of tires against gravel and the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. The woods, dark and sprawling, felt like a different world entirely. The lights of the rescue team illuminated the scene, but everything else was swallowed by the night. Blake's heart raced as he took in the sight before him. The overturned vehicle lay in a crumpled heap, the windows shattered, the doors barely hanging on their hinges. His focus shifted instantly. He wasn't just an officer anymore, he was a man in search of life amidst the wreckage. Max, his ever-reliable partner, was already on the move. His body sleek and focused as he darted through the underbrush, his nose to the ground, his ears alert for any sound that might offer a clue. Blake's breath caught in his throat, and he followed, his heart beating louder with each step, pushing forward in the dense darkness. The smell of gasoline mixed with the stench of burnt rubber and blood. Blake didn't falter, didn't look back. He had to keep moving. He knew Max would find them, knew the dog's instincts would lead them to the victims before time could run out. And he did. Max's bark echoed in the silence, sharp and commanding. Blake rushed forward, the emergency lights painting their surroundings in hues of red and blue, revealing the sight of a mother and her young child, trapped inside the wreckage, their faces pale and stricken with fear. Blake's hands were steady as he worked to pry open the car doors, but even as the medic team began to assess the situation, Blake couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. He and Max were part of this, part of the fragile balance between life and death. The lives they touched didn't always survive, and Blake could feel the fear in his chest tighten with each breath. Max moved in, his body between the officers and the injured family. His growl was low, the muscles in his frame taut, as he kept a sharp eye on the wreckage, guarding his human partner and the family. Blake finished securing the mother and child, getting them onto stretchers. He looked at Max, whose eyes were fixed on the family, understanding everything without a single word. Blake saw the quiet assurance in the dog's gaze. This was what they did. This was who they were. Max had once again proven that no matter how dark the world got, there was always a sliver of light. Always someone who would stand between the chaos and the helpless. It was in that moment, when the family was being driven away to safety, that Blake realized something profound. This was the price of healing. It wasn't the pain that came from the accidents, the failures, or even the losses. It was the responsibility of carrying that weight, of shouldering the hope of those who couldn't carry it themselves. Blake wasn't just an officer. He was a bridge between chaos and order, between life and death. And Max wasn't just a dog. He was the soul that held it all together. As the ambulance pulled away, Blake looked down at Max, who stood with his tail wagging softly. There was still so much to do, so many more moments yet to come. But for the first time in a long while, Blake felt peace. Not because everything was perfect, not because every life had been saved, but because, in that quiet moment, they had done what they were meant to do. They had saved what they could, and that was enough. The sun rose the next morning in a burst of golden light, the sky a soft pink and purple streaked with hints of orange. Blake stood at the window, watching the dawn break over the city. The world felt still, as if the universe was holding its breath in the early morning light. Max sat beside him, his presence a steady reminder that no matter how unpredictable life was, there was always something worth fighting for. Their journey wasn't over. It would never be over. There would always be more lives to save, more roads to drive, more rescues to carry out. But this morning, there was no rush, no urgency. Just the calm and quiet that only came after the storm. The stillness after the fight. Blake turned to Max, his heart swelling with gratitude for the bond they shared. A bond forged in the fires of their work, their trials, their unspoken trust. Together, they had learned what it meant to fight, to heal, and to keep moving forward, no matter what. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm glow across the city, Blake and Max both knew one thing for sure.